Hi everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Coast Connections. This is part one of a two-part episode that we're doing to celebrate the 75th commemorative anniversary of D-Day, to honor those who sacrificed so much for all the peace and freedom that we're here and able to enjoy. We want to really honor them and their sacrifice that they made by helping you understand what that invasion was all about and how it turned the course of history. And to do that, we have a very special guest here from the Juno Beach Center, all the way from Normandy, France, Scott Entwhistle.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, Scott. It's an honor to have you here. And it's lovely to see someone of your generation here. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned that your grandfather was a Normandy vet, part of the D-Day invasion force.
He did, yeah. He landed with the British Columbia Regiment in late July 1944.
And my father was a D-Day veteran as well, landed June 6, 1944. So it's really nice that we have two subsequent generations represented here.
Very true, very
so this is awesome.
Yeah.
So Scott, let's just lay the stage here. Let's go back to 1939, and Hitler's invaded Poland.
Yeah.
World War II is declared. This axis of evil is starting to spread across Europe, and Canada decided it's time to go to war.
Yes.
At that time, our army was like 10,000 people.
Yes, it was incredibly small. We were recovering from the Great Depression, so that was a 10-year period where the country was not doing very well. Economically, unemployment hit 26% at one point. The prairies were ravaged by dust storms and various other things. So the country was kind of slowly recovering, but war was certainly an unwelcome event at that point. And so Germany declares war, invades Poland on September 1st, the UK and France then on September 3rd, after an ultimatum declare war, and Canada actually waits though a week. It's not until September 10th that Canada actually declares war, and that's the first time that the Canadian government of their own accord has declared war, because in the First World War, we actually did not have the foreign policy ability to declare our own wars. When the UK went to war, that's when Canada went to war.
Yeah, interesting. So we went from this army of 10,000 people to the largest volunteer army in the world. 1.1 million people signed up. Most of them signed up. There was some conscription in the last couple of months of the war. So that is an incredible call when there was, what, 10 million people living in our country? Yeah,
it was a population of 11 million people, and 1.1 million ended up in uniform by 1945. And so it very quickly, thousands of Canadians rushed to recruit, rushed to sign up. The 1st Canadian Division of 8,000 men, I believe it is, leaves in December 1939, crosses the Atlantic over to the UK. So within a couple of months, we've gone from a force of only 10,000 really in the entire military to actually being able to send a division overseas.
And it was a very diverse group of people. I mean, it was from all parts of Canada and the northern part of Canada as well. There was, for the first time in history, women were actually in uniform, in Canadian uniforms. 50,000 women signed up. And there was Chinese Canadians, there was Japanese Canadians, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit Canadians. Everyone from coast to coast to coast joined. So it was a very diverse army.
Exactly, and it's something that struck me because I've done a fair amount of research on Canadians that served as part of my job. And you really get Canadians from every single walk of life, every occupation, every class, every corner of the country, signing up to fight for Canada and volunteering in most cases to go overseas and fight, this war that didn't directly affect Canada, but certainly affected people that they were related to.
Exactly, yeah. And those on the home front also had tremendous support for the troops over there as well.
Exactly, yeah. So again, 11 million people in the country, 1.1 million are in uniform, another million are working in war industries, that's like direct factories that are producing military goods, and then millions more working in kind of other industries, especially agriculture, because Canada was a huge supplier of food to the United Kingdom in particular, especially in 1939, 1940, 1941, when there's the UK is cut off essentially from the rest of its empire, but Canada is still sending a lot of their food supplies.
And Canada also, during that time, in the lead up to the invasion starting in 1939, 1940, produced a tremendous amount of military equipment.
Yes, I think that's an often understated contribution from Canada. And there's the typical military supplies, planes, tanks, warships, and Canada produced a great number of that. But we were particularly actually focused on producing trucks, which is kind of something that you wouldn't really think of and something that doesn't seem that consequential. But Canada actually produces 800,000 trucks during the Second World War, which is more than the number that Nazi Germany actually produces.
Wow.
So we were really the arsenal for a lot of the supply convoys that would keep a modern military going. Because of course the Second World War was one of the first mechanized wars where getting your troops supplied and moving quickly is one of the most important things. So if you have enough trucks, you can win the war, you can move more quickly than your enemy.
Yeah. And ships, planes, all that kind of thing. So
exactly. Like we're not talking a couple hundred, we're talking tens of thousands of a lot of those numbers. And not also just producing equipment, but also producing trained personnel. So one of the most crucial contributions that Canada made was something called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Now that was an idea that was put quickly into plan in 1939. The British realized that they can't really train their pilots in the UK because that airspace is contested most of the time. So they had this idea to basically install their training plan in the Canadian prairies. And so thousands of pilots, I believe it's about 160,000 pilots from Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, all over the world, these Allied pilots would come to Canada, train in relative peace and quiet, and then be shipped off to wherever they were going to fight in their theater of operations.
My mother was a young teacher in the summer of 1944 and dated a couple of those RAF pilots in southern Alberta.
I believe it's near Bracebridge, Ontario. There was a little Norway that was set up, a little Norwegian community, because there were a couple hundred Norwegian pilots that were training to go overseas.
Interesting. Yeah. Scott, let's go to the morning of D-Day. Now, this invasion had been planned for over 2 years. The Allies had tried to get in at various points along the French coast to no avail, and particularly Dieppe.
I think that's an important one to talk about. So it's 1942. The Germans have invaded the USSR at that point, so most of their attention is focused on the east. The Soviet Union, that was our ally, desperately asking for the Allies in the West to do something. And so this raid at Dieppe is planned. And it was never intended to be an invasion. It was kind of a test of the defenses to see how feasible is this. And the Canadians at that point hadn't really done much directly. There had been no real direct fighting involving Canadian troops. So there was a lot of appetite at home and in the government for the Canadians to do something, essentially. Although, of course, as we were saying, there was a lot of contributions being made that weren't direct combat.
Correct.
But the raid at Dieppe, 6,000 Allied troops crossed the channel, 5,000 of them are Canadian. So it is almost entirely a Canadian enterprise, and it is a complete military failure.
Yes.
It goes horrendously wrong. More than half the Canadians that get sent don't actually return. There are 900, or a little bit more than that actually, that are killed in the operation. So the biggest issue was it simply wasn't planned well enough. An amphibious invasion requires a ton of preparation, bombardments beforehand. You need the element of surprise. You need to know exactly where you're landing, and a lot of that simply wasn't there. So there's one particularly bad example of. It's on Blue Beach, which is one of kind of the beaches on the flank of the invasion. The Royal Canadian Regiment lands there. 550 men land on this very, very narrow beach. If you ever visit it, you would wonder why anyone would ever try and land there. The beach is only a couple hundred meters long, and there's very tall cliffs on either side. And I believe it's only about 50 of the regiment that actually makes it off the beach and back to the UK. The rest are killed or wounded. So, and it's just a horrendous time. But also massive amounts of bravery. There's 2 Victoria Crosses that are awarded to Canadians on that day. So, which is of course the highest honor that any Allied troop can be, or any British Commonwealth troop can be given. So, massive bravery, but again, a failure in planning that leads to a lot of Canadian losses.
So we get to June 6, 1944. We've learned from some of these horrific disasters.
Exactly.
And the Germans are not expecting us to be landing on the Normandy coast there. They're thinking, because that's actually the furthest distance from Britain, about 120...
It's about 160 kilometers from the UK to the Norman coastline, and you're exactly right. So by 1944, the Germans have been working on their defenses for the last 4 years. It's 6,000 kilometers of defenses called the Atlantic Wall. 17,000 defensive structures are built along this 6,000 kilometers. So to put that in perspective, because it's a very large number, it is roughly equivalent to building a defensive line from Vancouver all the way to Halifax. It's roughly the same distance. So
And these are machine gun nests, these are bunkers, these are explosive landmines.
Everywhere from small machine
wire.
gun nests to massive artillery that can throw a shell 30 kilometers, a 2-ton shell 30 kilometers at incoming warships. So it is incredibly well defended, but in certain places, better defended than others. The Germans were convinced that the attack was going to come in the north of France at the Pas de Calais, where it's only 25 kilometers across. It makes a lot more sense to land there. The Allies know this, so one of the things they do is they create a fake army group that's then positioned in the close part of the UK to that Pas de Calais. They have inflatable tanks and fake warships, everything to make it look like to a German aircraft that's flying above, well, that's where they're assembling for, that's where the invasion is going to happen. And the Canadians, it had been leaked to the Germans that the Canadians were moving into that area. The Germans, knowing their reputation from the First World War as kind of elite units, assumed that wherever the Canadians were, well, that's where the invasion is actually going to happen. So this deception is so effective that on June 6th, when the landing actually happens, the Germans are still convinced that this is just a fake landing, and the real landing is coming up north. And they believe that until up to 2 months afterwards. So there's still German units waiting in the north for this invasion that never comes, and as a result, they never send their full force to Normandy, which gives the units in Normandy time to breathe, essentially.
Time to get inland.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the night before the invasion, well, actually, they were supposed to go June the 5th.
Yes, exactly.
But there was very bad weather, very turbulent seas, and they had to delay the invasion.
Yeah.
So there was a very narrow window of time in terms of weather where they could get in.
So, and this is the issue the Allies have is, again, they want to keep this location so secret. So no one knows where they're going. Only the highest officers are actually aware of the final location. So they load all the troops up onto the landing craft on June 4th. In expectation of the invasion, and then a lot more people then find out where they're going, and then on June 5th, all of a sudden, the weather isn't good enough, and they decide to delay it 24 hours. And so all of a sudden, you can't let these troops off the landing craft because your security has been lost. So a lot of these guys actually spent 24 hours or even longer on these landing craft in stormy conditions.
Oh my God.
And of course, a lot of these guys were from Winnipeg and Regina. They'd never seen the ocean before.
No, exactly.
And so they were, on these small landing craft.
Prairie boys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's on June 5th that the meteorologists come into Eisenhower's office, General Eisenhower, who was in charge, and gives his presentation, and half his generals say go, half his generals say don't go. It was unsure, but if they didn't go on June 6th, they wouldn't go for another 3 weeks. The weather was going to be even worse over the next time. So Eisenhower makes that fateful decision. We go, and the invasion is launched.
And the largest invasion in military history.
Yes, exactly.
Let's go through some of those numbers. I think there was 5,000 ships.
7,000
7,000 ships.
11,000 aircraft and 156,000 men. It has never been eclipsed since. It is a scale that you can't even fathom.
No.
Just the idea of 7,000 gray masses coming over the horizon and what that would have looked like. Just streams of aircraft over and over and over coming again. And that's one of the things, if you read any of the German accounts of the day, or even French civilians, they were used to Allied aircraft flying over at that point, of course, doing missions in various places. But it was after the third or fourth hour of aircraft still flying over that a lot of them started to realize
something's different.
This is something more going on here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to start the invasion, first off, though, in midnight, even June 5th, you have the paratroopers landing.
Yes.
So of those 156,000 Allied troops, 26,000 of them were paratroopers. And the idea there being is you land them on the sides of the invasion so they can disrupt the reinforcements coming in, they can take bridges and key crossroads, and they just delay the landing, or delay the German response to the landings as much as possible. Because it's the first 24 hours that are the most crucial. So even if the Allies had 10 times the planes, the tanks, the men, just a massive equipment advantage, you can only put so much of that ashore at one time. And so if they can react, if the Germans can react quickly enough, it's entirely possible that they can stop this landing.
Right.
And so having those paratroopers there to disrupt and just get in the way of the Germans trying to reinforce, absolutely essential. And on the eastern flank of the invasion, it's where the British paratroopers land, among them 500 Canadian paratroopers.
And it was a moonless night and a windy night, and a lot
yes.
of them got blown off course. And
it was a full moon, actually.
Was it a full moon?
It was a full moon.
Okay.
Yeah, that was one of the necessary preconditions. Is paratrooping is dangerous enough, doing so in darkness even more so, but if you do it without the full moon, it's going to be a complete disaster. So they did have to have a full moon, and so they had that, but as you say, there was quite a lot of wind, and therefore the vast majority of the paratroopers, especially the Canadians, didn't end up where they were supposed to. Some of them ended up 20 kilometers from where they were supposed to be, and then you've got to march 20 kilometers, often through flooded fields, because the Germans had flooded all the fields to make it more difficult for an invasion.
So We've got some amazing photos here that we're going to show,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about some of these photos as we go through to talk a little bit more about what happened that morning. They all set out about 5 a.m. from the English coastline.
Oh, even earlier, midnight.
Midnight,
Yeah,
okay.
it's several hours to cross, so.
Yeah. Okay. So our first picture here I want to show is a really interesting one. It's June the 5th. It's the day before the invasion.
Yeah.
And it's a group of, well, sorry, here's the landing beaches themselves, just to put things in context.
So yeah, well, just this is it's 80 kilometers of the French coastline right there, stretching from west to east. You have Utah and Omaha, the American beaches, Gold and Sword, the British beaches, and then the Canadian beach there at Juno Beach, right in the middle.
Very good. And the next photo is this is the one the day before, and this is just a group on one of the naval vessels, just having some devotions, a moment of prayer, and there's a lot of photos like that in the World War II collections of, you know, can you imagine you're going into this horrible unknown? So yeah, I guess everybody found their God.
Well, exactly. Well, and this is something that's been training for the last 3 or 4 years for a lot of these guys too. They've been waiting a long time for this invasion itself. So this picture gives some indication as to the scale of the invasion. These are landing craft waiting in Southampton for the actual invasion. But again, a lot of the troops crossed in ships that were that small. In very turbulent weather in the channel, so
rough seas.
not a good time overnight,
No.
especially with the anxiety of what was to come.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then this is just landing craft coming in for the invasion itself. So for the beach itself, Juno Beach is 8 kilometers long. 14,000 Canadians land on Juno Beach during the day. The assault wave itself, for about a kilometer stretch of coastline, they would have had 10 of those landing craft coming in about 100 meters apart. So again, we talked about 7,000 ships and the massive armada, but you ask any D-Day veteran that came in on the assault and they will tell you they never felt more alone than that final run-in. All of a sudden, they're in the landing craft, it's just them and 10 men, and basically everything else has disappeared. They don't hear the aircraft anymore, they can't see the ships. It just seems like it's them against this massive array of defenses that they're coming up on. Yeah. And so then this is the landings at Courseulles-sur-Mer, which is on the western side of Juno Beach. That's where the Royal Winnipeg Rifles came ashore. Now the Juno Beach Center itself is located just a little bit to the west, a little bit to the left on that picture. And so right there, it's where so now we're on to, this is Balnial-sur-Mer. That's where the Queen's Armed Rifles of Canada landed, and in the distance there, you can see that's Canada House, which we'll talk about later, the iconic house.
We'll talk a little bit more about that in our next episode as well. And they were carrying bicycles in that one, but they ended up abandoning the bicycles because it was not a good
that picture was taken as the reserve brigades were coming in around noon, about a couple hours after the initial landings, because the first guys landed as the sun was coming up, 5 or 6, 7 a.m. essentially. And so they have bicycles, the idea being they would land and they could bicycle past the units that land first, and then they could get to their objective. The problem is when you're trying to land 22,000 troops on Juno, 14,000 Canadian, 8,000 Brits, there was the biggest traffic jam I think Normandy had ever seen, and so no one could really move anywhere. And while the invasion was a massive success, the German resistance was quite severe, and so that did also delay. So no unit on D-Day actually achieved their objectives. They all fell short, but by the end of the day, all 5 beaches were secured. The invasion was a success.
The Atlantic Wall had been breached.
Exactly, yeah. And I believe we have some footage of the landings.
Oh, this is, I just want to check this one out. This is, you've got barrage balloons there. You can see the fighting. That's, I think, Omaha Beach we're looking at, a U.S. beach on that shot?
Yes, I believe so. So the barrage balloons are there because basically you just dangle as many steel cables as those as you possibly can, and low-flying aircraft, if they know they're there, have to avoid it. They can't possibly risk, especially at night, coming in and hitting those cables.
Okay.
And so this is one of the bunkers that was on Juno Beach. So again, Normandy wasn't quite as well defended as other parts of the landings, but still very well defended. The 1.5 kilometers in front of the Juno Beach Center, that was a strong point 31 it was called, and there were 30 bunkers and defensive positions that were constructed there. So 12 machine guns, 3 anti-tank guns, and mortars as well, to try and stop the Allied troops that were landing. And so it just in the space in front of the center, it's B Company, Royal Winnipeg Rifles, that comes ashore ashore. They have 120 men with them and 15 amphibious tanks. The tanks would then swim ashore, massive skirts around them, which was incredibly dangerous. Again, with the stormy channel, they could only take waves of a meter or two, and so quite often they would flood and sink to the bottom. But less than 2 hours after the initial landing, only 27 of those 119 men were still standing. The rest were killed or wounded. So there are stories of the ramp dropping on the landing craft and 9 out of 10 men instantly getting taken out. So if any viewers have seen Saving Private Ryan, it's not quite that realistic, but there was certainly that level of intensity and heavy losses taken, especially in that first wave as they fought ashore.
And we've got some amazing black and white film footage that we're going to show, courtesy of the Juno Beach Center Association, so thank you for this. But it's a very rare piece of footage, and we'll just talk through this as we go.
Yeah, so this is actually the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment coming ashore at Courseulles-sur-Mer. It's a lovely sea walk now is the kind of ironic thing, is they've got a lovely little boulevard that you can go along there, but this is the initial assault. And this is the only footage, the 2 clips that we have, live footage at least, of the landings of that first wave. So there were combat journalists that were embedded with every single unit that came ashore, or every beach at least, but when you're trying to film something, the cameras, aren't today's cameras, and it is incredibly difficult to capture any footage. So even to risk your life to get this footage is very impressive.
And the raw courage this took, the guts, the bravery to just hop off those landing craft into the great unknown. I mean, this is so chilling to watch this, and how many of these young men didn't come back? And
quite a number, especially for the assault regiments. Canadian losses on the day aren't as bad as thought. The projections were up to 50% casualties. Thankfully, it was much less than that, but still 359 Canadians are killed and over 600 are wounded, and most of that in the first hour or two of the invasion. Now, a lot of these landing craft, doesn't happen here, but the Germans had not only built bunkers on the beach, but they'd also lined the beaches with obstacles and landmines to stop these landing craft from coming in. So a lot of the landing craft actually hit these mines and would sink and force the troops to swim ashore, essentially. And when you're wearing 50 or 60 pounds of kit and you're all of a sudden thrown into the English Channel, there were quite a few men that drowned as well. So,
and the weight of their equipment would just weigh them down too.
Exactly.
Staggering.
There's one veteran that I spoke to recently, actually. He landed in the first wave on D-Day, and he was thrown out of his landing craft, and he came ashore with nothing but his knife and fork. He'd lost everything else, but he will joke today that he'd heard the French cooking was quite good, and that he wanted to experience it. So,
and that is so typical of a Canadian veteran.
Exactly.
They always look at sort of a humorous anecdote about the war rather than the horror that we're seeing right now.
Yes, exactly.
These young men, the ones that did return, were forever scarred. And just the sheer courage that took, and the training, and the infrastructure in place for this to all happen. What this doesn't capture is the noise, and the smoke, and the smell, and the blood, and the because overhead and behind them, the ships are firing onto shore to take out the German fortifications.
Yeah, well, at almost every level. So you've got, the mortars that are only firing a couple hundred meters, but then you've got the destroyers and smaller warships that are firing their smaller caliber guns, and then you've got the battleships behind that are launching 2-ton projectiles over their heads.
And the Lancasters and Spitfires overhead.
And the 7,000 aircraft that are, 11,000 aircraft that are flying above to capture it. So yeah, for sure, when you don't have the sound, I don't think there's anything that could possibly replicate what it was like to be there that day, for sure.
Yeah, and the smell of all the mortar fire.
Yes, exactly.
Everything. So thank you for that footage. That's very rare, and we really appreciate that. And it's just remarkable how these young men, the average age was what, 23?
Not even, 21, 19, 20.
They were signing up when they were 17, 18 years old.
Exactly, yeah, and it's one of the things at the center that we've, that's why the guide program, and that's why, I'm not that much older than the guys that would have landed there, is one of the things the veterans that founded the museum wanted was to have people that were the same age as the troops that were landing there. So, but yeah, you've got everything from 16-year-olds even landing. There are 2 16-year-old Canadians that are buried in Normandy that lied about their age and managed to sneak over. And of course, at that time, really, as long as you could lie about your age, you looked over 18, and no one that knew you saw you in uniform, you could make it. A lot of people were caught and kicked out, but quite a few made it over. And yeah, unfortunately, 2 of those 16-year-olds made it over. I always made it a point whenever we had a school group grade 10, 11, 12s. Okay, well, how many of you are over 16? And everyone raises their hand. Well, unfortunately,
16.
most of you are older than the youngest guy that's buried in Blatteville-sur-Lez. So.
Yeah. Two of my favorite veterans, D-Day veterans, I just want to share with us.
Yeah, for sure.
This is my friend, Staff Sergeant Raymond Varney.
Okay.
He's 19 years old in this photo.
Yeah.
He landed on D+4.
Okay.
He was a commander of a tank division. They followed the front lines and fixed all the tanks, cannibalized tanks for parts. And he's still alive. I had coffee with him this morning. He's 96 years old.
Yeah.
And he was too shy to come on the show today. He said he's too private. And I said, Ray, you're not too private, you're a staff sergeant. But still couldn't convince him to come on. My other favorite veteran is my father. He landed the same day as Ray. They might have come in contact with each other, but my father passed away about 10 years ago. And he had his 23rd birthday the morning he landed on Juno Beach.
Yeah, that's...
Amazing.
Yeah.
And when he landed, he was driving a truck off and landed in a bomb crater. They thought the landing ramp was on the beach. Went right into a bomb crater. He and the truck both sunk right to the bottom, and he had to come up through, with all his gear on, through all the blood and the oil and the smoke and everything on that beach, and he made it up.
Exactly, yeah.
And he made it home and lived a long and happy life. He and his 3 siblings all served in Europe. 3 brothers and a sister, and they all came home physically unharmed, but certainly carrying scars of that experience.
Well, and that's a common theme that I saw, at least, and I think the museum has seen for the last 13 years, 15 years, sorry, is that a lot of these veterans simply never spoke of anything that they saw. I know my own great-grandfather, again, he served there and never said a single word. The only my grandmother and I have kind of pieced together things after the fact, but I think it's very common that a lot of these veterans simply never mentioned that they, where they were or what they did.
No,
it's too
and
painful.
I think they didn't want us to know what they had to go through.
Exactly.
So when they would talk about it, it was something rather humorous or something palatable. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So we also have a D-Day, dog tag program for other veterans. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in our second episode because we're running a little bit short on time here. But when you do the tours at the Juno Beach Center, how many visitors come there a year?
So we get about 80,000 visitors a year at the moment, which about a third of them are Canadian. Always want to push that number up, but it's been a third Canadian pretty steady for the last 15 years or 16 years of operations. So,
Nice. I did ask my father later in life if he wanted to go back to Juno Beach, and it was a definitive, absolutely no, not in a million years. And when I went in 2015, it was so beautiful and surreal and gorgeous with the big skies and the way the French and Canadians have preserved that area. I knew my dad would have loved to have seen it.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think a lot of people, Normandy is maybe a battle or a landing zone, but it's certainly a place that people live in today, and it's a place a lot of people just go on vacation and just to go see a beach. And that's what's so great about the museum, though, is that we get a lot of European visitors that honestly don't know what this was or what was going on, and they kind of wander into the museum, and you can connect that history to them and say, well, you might be here for your beach vacation, but 75 years ago this was a much different scene.
Yes, and it's people like you and the Juno Beach Center Association that are keeping this alive.
Exactly.
So we'll go into that more in our part 2 of this, Scott, but for now, thank you so much for your wealth of information. You're such a knowledgeable young man. I just love it. You're just you're going to be carrying this torch forward for us, and I really appreciate that. So thank you for bringing all the things with us today here, and we look forward to part 2, talking about the Juno Beach Center itself.
Exactly.
Thanks, Scott.
Fantastic.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for all of those who have served our country. We thank you for the peace and freedom that your sacrifice has brought us. We'll see you on the next episode.